We crossed the border into Iraq and we made our way slowly but surely towards Basra. I was in a section, 7 people in the back of the warrior. You drive with the warrior, the gunner, and the commander. And I was machine gunner, first one out the back of the warrior. For the first couple of weeks, we sort of formed a ring of steel around Basra. And the mortars was raining in on us hourly. The first one would land, you'd get in a ditch or anything, and you'd see, say, 50 metres away, the next one would land. 30 metres away, the next one would land. 15 metres away. You'd think, carries on like this, the next one's on my head. I don't know if you've ever been in a car crash or you've been mugged and you get that feeling for that split second when the butterflies are going and everything, where you don't know what's going to happen to you. If you can imagine that feeling 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's what it felt like to be out there.
That was Soldier Tromans talking about his experience in the Iraq, or at least modern, war front. Today's poem, then, Remains by Simon Armitage, explores the ongoing effects of war on current soldiers. As normal in this video, we're going to focus on AO1, having a sensitive and evaluative approach to the poem. AO2, exploring effects created by language, form and structure. And AO3, an assured understanding between the poem, the time it's written, and the way the audience engage with it. Today's poem then is written by Simon Armitage. Armitage wrote Remains after interviewing veterans as part of a 2000 Channel 4 documentary called The Not Dead. The speaker in the poem is based on Guardsman Tromans, who you saw at the beginning of this video, a British soldier who recounted the experience of shooting a looter during his time in Iraq. When we look a little bit in detail about Simon Armitage's history, we find that he wrote his first thesis on the effects of television on youth offenders and worked as a probation officer. So he was ideally placed to interview the soldiers and the effects of war on them. One of his more famous works is a translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. If you're not familiar with that tale, it is a tale where a knight gets his head chopped off but keeps coming back to life to return to battle 1 year later. Someone who is then disabled but keeps on fighting.
When you say war poetry these days, people tend to presume that you're talking about the poets of the First World War. They're the last generation of trained writers and trained soldiers. I've never been involved in a war, I'm not a soldier, I'm probably a bit of a coward. So my route then into writing about conflict was to talk to other people about their experiences and to listen to their testimonies.
And that's, of course, exactly what he's doing in the poem Remains. He's interviewing Guardsman Tromans about his experience on the war front. Here is the poem itself then. The poem Remains by Simon Armitage.
On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank. And one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. While myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So all 3 of us opened fire. 3 of a kind, all letting fly. And I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed, and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. And the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands.
The poem exploring the ongoing effects of this horrific death on Guardsman Tromans. Now let's hear from Guardsman Tromans himself about the events of the poem.
On another occasion, we get sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank. And one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So all three of us open fire. Three of a kind, let him fly. And I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. In total, I think it took 12 rounds. And I can still to this day remember as every round passed through. And he was lying there with his insides basically on the floor. And we had to leave him, clear the bank. And it was approximately 4 stories high, 4 or 5 stories. And we cleared the entire of the bank, got to the roof. I looked over, the bloke was still there, crying in agony. We come back down, and another lad who was in my section literally picked his insides up, dropped them back into his body, and he was just chucked into the back of the warrior, never to be seen again. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out, writhing in pain, screaming in agony. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol, I walk right over him, week after week. That's the first time I'd ever ended someone's life.
A hard-hitting poem there from Armitage. Troman clearly suffering there from what's known as PTSD, a syndrome that many soldiers suffer from once they return home.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health condition caused by a traumatic experience. Symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder include flashbacks, nightmares, feeling very anxious, and having difficulty sleeping. The main treatments for PTSD are antidepressants and talking therapies. Any situation that a person finds traumatic can cause PTSD. Examples include road accidents, an assault, and childbirth. So if we apply this context to the poem Remains, we have a soldier who's not only witnessed but also taken part in the brutal killing of another human being. Now on the surface it seems like this soldier is just doing his job. He was out on patrol, he saw this looter and did as he was trained to do. He opened fire. But the story doesn't end there. This man and this incident haunts the soldier. Even when he leaves the war and returns home, he can't get him out of his head, no matter how much he tries. And the poem actually refers to the fact that he's tried drinking and he's tried drugs, but nothing's working. So this poem is a very clear exploration of PTSD in the armed forces.
Now we know a little bit about the poem and its context. Let's turn our attention to the poem itself. You'll see boxes appear around the outside that in black study structure and in white study language choices. The poem begins mid-action with "on another occasion," which immediately drops the reader into a situation already unfolding. This seems like part of an ongoing story that was going on before the poem started and of course after it ends. It suggests this is one of many instances, creating a sense of routine violence or repetition in the speaker's experience. The informal, almost offhand phrase, "we got sent out," resembles spoken language, setting a personal and colloquial tone. This contrasts with the seriousness of the content, reflecting the speaker's attempt to normalise or emotionally detach from the violence that's being caused and seen. Words such as looters raiding a bank create an image of chaos and disorder, but also ambiguity. The actual crime or justification is unclear, raising questions about legitimacy of the violence. Did these people really need to be shot? Who were they? Why did they need to loot the bank in the first place? The ambiguity and juxtaposition of probably and possibly creates tension and uncertainty. It reflects the soldier's internal conflict and the moral grey area in which he's operating. This moment is centred on the poem's exploration of guilt. He may have killed somebody who was in fact innocent. The military jargon here, "opening fire," contrasts with the earlier colloquialisms, suggesting a sudden switch to professional or trained behaviour. It shows the automatic, almost detached response from the soldiers in combat. We then, in stanza 3, see some graphic and violent imagery. "Rips through his life" personifies the bullets and heightens the brutality of what's happened. The word life rather than body makes the violence feel more total. It's not just physical death, but existential annihilation. The verb swear suggests trauma or obsession. The speaker relives this moment vividly. Let's move now to the middle of the poem. Although grouped together, the speaker begins to internalise the memory. The transition from collective action to personal reflection signals growing guilt and personal trauma. Pain itself and the image of agony elevate the looter's suffering to universal level. This could suggest the speaker's growing awareness of the moral and emotional implications of his actions. The grand, almost poetic line, "pain itself, the image of agony," is immediately undercut by blunt, grotesque realism, tosses his guts back into his body, highlighting the disorientating clash between the emotional horror and physical routine. A metaphor for the lingering memory of the looter. Blood evokes violence and death, while shadow is just something that follows and cannot be escaped. The phrase implies that guilt and trauma are imprinted on the speaker's mind as permanently as a stain on the street. The middle section continues the sense of a stream of consciousness or ongoing memory. The lack of clear stopping points reflects the moment replays without resolution. Now let's move to the end of the poem. The reuse of the phrase "probably armed, possibly not" shows the speaker is stuck in a loop of trauma, obsessively revisiting the moral uncertainty of the shooting. Was he meant to kill him? Was he an innocent man that was killed here? The repetition also serves as an indicator of PTSD. He cannot move past this moment of doubt. The anaphoric structure, repetition at the start of successive lines, mirrors the trauma invades both conscious and subconscious states. The effect here is relentless. Harsh consonant sounds mirror the speaker's frustration and desperation, the triad of coping mechanisms, sleep, drink, drugs, suggests a total breakdown of mental health. The short final stanza acts as a conclusion or emotional collapse. The brevity contrasts with earlier stanzas and reflects a stark, hopeless finality. The flatness of the final line, simple, unadorned, declarative, carries a crushing sense of resignation. His life in my bloody hands. The looter, or rather the guilt associated with his death, is now a permanent part of the speaker's psyche. This line reintroduces the idea that trauma is inescapable and internalised. Now let's summarise the poem. Who is the poem about? It's about a soldier who struggles with guilt and trauma after killing a man during combat. It represents the mental burden carried by many soldiers even after they leave the battlefield. What is the poem about? Remains is about a soldier who, after shooting a looter during a conflict, is haunted by the traumatic memory of the event. The poem explores the psychological toll of war, focusing on themes of guilt, moral ambiguity, and the enduring impact of violence. Why did Armitage write the poem? Remains is written to highlight the psychological effects of war on soldiers, especially the lasting impact of trauma and guilt. Simon Armitage aimed to give a voice to those who suffer in silence after experiencing violence in combat. Now we're going to turn our attention to 3 key quotes from the poem and what we might say about it. Here is quote number 1, probably armed, possibly not, and what you might want to say about that line. Here is quote number 2. And here you go, some points made about it. And quote number 3. Those 3 quotes put together then give you analysis of the lines as well as the meanings behind the words and their effects. If I was to put all those into an essay then, this is perhaps the structure I would follow. You can see the 9-part structure that many of you might already be familiar with from my earlier videos. Each sentence here reflects on one sentence of a full paragraph, so a 9-paragraph answer in response in total. You can see all elements are addressed. You've got poet knowledge or context there. You've got meaning of the poem at the top and bottom, so that's step 1 and step 9. And then for step 4, 5, 6, you've got that analysis needed for the pass grade at GCSE. If you were to copy out these step-by-step instructions and then look at your notes for the poem, you'd be able to create very easily grade 5 responses. Now, in the exam, it's very likely that one of the questions will ask you to compare 2 poems. And this section of the video is going to focus on how you might do that. The essay example given here is, how is the theme of war compared in Remains and War Photographer? You can see I've got my notes in front of me on Remains and War Photographer. I've made notes on the kind of words each one uses, some of the technical devices they use as well, and an explanation. So these are taken directly from either this video or my video on War Photographer. How might these be turned then into a paragraph? Well, we also need to look at structure as well. Doing language doesn't quite cut it. So I'll need to focus on structure. So here are my notes on Remain structure and War Photographer structure as well. As I said, how then would I turn those into a response? You'll notice on the board there are 2 paragraphs. This will be part of a full response. My opening paragraph at the top of the screen there shows my introduction. I simply compare the similarities and differences between the 2 poems, but don't need to use quotes in introduction. This gives me then an overview of both poems. You'll notice I give some simple comparisons there. In both and each poem begins, simplistically showing what they've got that is similar. Then if you look at my paragraph underneath, you'll see the quotes highlighted in yellow as I begin to compare the start of Remains and the start of War Photographer. The connective in the centre there is On the Other Hand, and you can see that both poems have kind of been treated equally, with about 5 lines or so on each. Now this is a grade 5 response. You can see I've zoomed in on the word finally. I've explained each quote in about 3 sentences or 2 sentences or so, which clearly compares the 2 poems. Use this as a starting point then to show how to compare 2 poems, and if you want to continue this yourself, you'd now look at the middle of each poem and the end of each poem. I hope that's useful then, just as a modelled example of a pass grade paragraph and paragraph comparison. Let's remind ourselves then of this powerful poem before ending this video.
On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all 3 of us opened fire, 3 of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave. But I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed, and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands.
Thank you then for listening to this revision video of Remains by Simon Armitage.